welcome to some more questions and answers here on the Old Front Line. These are questions submitted by you, the podcast listeners, and each month we select some of the best questions that have been submitted via email and the Discord server to answer here and hopefully give us all fresh perspectives and new knowledge of this vast subject of the Great War. So let's begin. I've been following the pathways of the Old Front Line quite a lot in the last month and since I last recorded an episode of these questions and answers. And doing trips like that often makes me reflect on some of the things that we've spoken about here, because each of these episodes is different to the normal ones in that we kind of cover 4 different subjects in small bites. And while that hopefully interests you and the questions are answered for those of you who've posed them in the way that you hoped, it also makes me think about some of the wider aspects of the First World War, but also some of the micro detail as well. And just last week I was staying on the outskirts of Albert doing a recce not of the Somme battlefields but of the Hindenburg line, which of course is not that far away, and I'm staying right close to the Tara-Usna hills. And that made me think about some of the questions and feedback I had relating to the Albert-Bapaume Road episode of the podcast that I did quite recently. And this is one of the things I really love about doing this podcast, is that I find myself being drawn into so many different aspects of the First World War. And when I combine that with visiting the ground as it is today, I find myself following my own advice, something that I'm sure not many of us really do, in that I begin to see those different layers of the First World War and how they all fit together. But it's some new questions and answers that we've got for this week, and as usual, keep sending them in. I'm finding them more and more fascinating, and I'm amazed at some of the things that you've been asking about. So keep them coming in. Keep on sending the supplementary information that you do when we talk about these different subjects. But for now, let's get down to the questions and begin with our first question. All of these this week have come in via email, and our first question is from Doug Bell. Doug asks, would the soldiers have talked about the Battle of the Somme at the time in 1916, or did that action only become known as that sometime later when the whole war could be looked at as a series of actions? Now, this is a really good question, Doug, because the men at the time would have known that they were in the Somme area. They would have been told that. They would have had an idea that they were in a village close to the town of Albert. They might have gone into Albert. They would have seen, possibly for the first time, large numbers of French troops who were on the fringes of that Somme sector. They may have even been one of the units that was billeted close to the River Somme. They may have swam in the River Somme, bathed in it, as part of their rest and recuperation behind the lines. So they would have been aware of the idea of a region, possibly to them a county called the Somme. But when the fighting began on the 1st of July 1916, would they have called it the Battle of the Somme? Probably not initially. They would have called it perhaps the Somme Offensive, and that is a phrase that you see used quite a lot in contemporary documents. But the actual phrase, the Battle of the Somme, is something that is drawn out of the propaganda that appears in response to this offensive beginning. And you see that term Battle of the Somme being begun to be used in newspapers. You see it drawn into sharp focus with the Battle of the Somme film that was then shown from September 1916 onwards to vast numbers of people until Star Wars was shown in 1977. More people went to see the Battle of the Somme than any other film in British cinema history. So it had a huge impact, and that phrase, the Battle of the Somme, entered the kind of public consciousness of the Great War, of the First World War as it would become known. But the men on the ground would have known where they fought. When I interviewed veterans, of course they knew when I spoke to them that they were part of the Battle of the Somme because they'd probably read a few books about it. But at the time, they would have associated, and often when we were discussing it, would refer to actions relating to specific villages. Alf Rozelle, for example, who was in the Royal Fusiliers, talked about the attack at Mash Valley at Overlers, and that was his initial phase of the Battle of the Somme, where for him those pathways of the Somme came together. And he might not have been aware at the time that they were part of a larger offensive, that attacks were going on other parts of that Somme front while his unit was assaulting across that valley towards the German trenches, because an infantry soldier and ordinary soldiers' view was very narrow. They were not really aware of what was going on in that big, wider picture, and they were not let into that kind of information. They would get some kind of pep talks from senior officers. There might be parades when war news was read out, but soldiers would often refer to them as comic cuts, as if it was kind of made up. Fake news, we'd call it today, and they weren't really sure whether half of these things they were being told were true. So for the men at the time, they began to realise that there were these sectors where the British Army was fighting. Ypres in Flanders, a lot of them probably thought that Ypres was in France, and in fact a lot of official records referred to Ypres as being in France. But then there were other sectors around towns like Armentières, which we perhaps now call the Forgotten Front. They knew about Luz, and they knew about Arras, and many other places besides as the war rolled on. But for them to frame their experience in a contemporary moment at the time, in terms of things like the Battle of the Somme, the Battle of Luz, the Battle of Cambrai, was something that I don't think really happened on a great scale. And when we read contemporary letters, you don't see a massive amount of reference to this. I mean, from a censor point of view, as we discussed in the episode on letters from the trenches, soldiers were only allowed to write a certain amount anyway, but I don't think they would have used that kind of phraseology. They would have referred to landmarks, places and things that they saw. And again, kind of talking to the veterans, that was often difficult to kind of penetrate that, to try and find out actually where a man had served. Today, of course, we can check this with war diaries and the whole kind of digitised regimental histories and unit histories and divisional histories. But, of course, in the 80s when I was doing that, that was a lot harder. And before me, with Middlebrook and Rose Coombs and Lynn MacDonald and all these other people interviewing veterans, they had the same kind of problems. So the names and the structure by which we know these battles of the First World War is something that was really kind of invented in the post-war world. The Battle Nomenclature Committee got together and decided to break the war up into phases. I mean, historians do this. Historians look at the past, they make sense of the past, and they categorise it, label it, give it names, so that there can be a wider understanding of what it is and what it means. And I'm sitting here looking at Beck's Order of Battle, which was a series of volumes that were published in the post-war world that showed the organisation of divisions and corps and armies in the First World War. And this volume concerns the armies and the corps. And for Rawlinson's Fourth Army, which fought the central part of the Somme front, the major part of the Somme offensive from July to November of 1916, the battle is broken down into 32 separate phases, from the Battle of Albert through to the capture of the Pozières Ridge, through to all the fighting where the woods are named to give those elements of the campaign a name. And it shows how this was done so that later an official historian could sit down and write the story of the Battle of the Somme through those different phases and link it to the regiments and corps and divisions and brigades of that army that had served there in 1916. So the Battle of the Somme is a construct, really, but it's an interesting construct that helps us understand the past. To the men at the time, it was something that was almost meaningless. They knew roughly where they were, sometimes only vaguely where they were, and dates really didn't mean much to them as well. When we look at the official end of the Battle of the Somme on the 18th of November 1916, the men at the time had no idea that that date was the end of the Somme, because that was something that wasn't really discussed and decided upon until long after the war. For most of them who remained on that Somme front during the winter of 1916-17, the fighting as it moved up towards the Hindenburg Line would have just seemed a continuation of it. So this whole idea of timeline and past and pathways and the layers of the First World War come together very, very well in this question, Doug. And I hope that's kind of answered it. And it shows how complex history is really in the way we do construct it and understand it and give it these labels. And it's good to question whether those labels mean much to us more than a century later. So if we move on to question number 2, that comes from Owen Greeny. Owen asks, I was wondering if you had any insight into how aware troops, and especially Irish troops, were of the 1916 Easter Rising in Dublin, and if it affected them in any way. I know the Irish Republican leader for the War of Independence, Tom Barry, was serving in the British Army in Mesopotamia during the Great War, and he recalls in his memoirs how it awakened a sense of patriotism in him. Well, I mean, I wouldn't claim to be an expert on Irish history, but the role of Irish troops has interested me greatly over the years, and something that you can't ignore if you study the battles of the Western Front, and indeed some of the other theatres of war as well, like Gallipoli and Salonika. So Irish troops were formed principally into 3 divisions during the First World War: the 10th Irish, which was at Gallipoli and then Salonika, the 16th Irish Division, and the 36th Ulster Division. Both of those served on the Western Front. Ireland was one country. There'd been a whole discussion about home rule, breaking away from Britain in the Edwardian period. But when the war had come along, that discussion wasn't exactly parked in the corner, but it was put to one side because many people who were part of that nationalist cause saw that Germany was the greater enemy. And if they then stepped forward and served and did their duty in this war and demonstrated what Ireland could do and what Irishmen were prepared to do to serve Britain, to serve a wider cause, perhaps they might be in a stronger position to ask for those things that the nationalist cause had demanded in that Edwardian period. So you see men right across Ireland flocking to enlist. The 10th Irish and the 16th Irish divisions, which were formed largely from southern regiments, so units like the Connaught Rangers, the Royal Munster Fusiliers, the Royal Dublin Fusiliers, the Royal Irish Fusiliers, all of these kind of regiments were formed into those 2 divisions, and the Ulster Division was formed from some of the northern recruited regiments like the Royal Irish Rifles and the Royal Inniskilling Fusiliers. Now, in terms of the men, let's just take the Western Front. That was the nearest theatre of war to what was happening back home on the home front in the wider Great Britain, of which Ireland was a part. And we're not going to go through the reasons for the Easter Rising, but there was this uprising in Ireland, in Dublin, in April of 1916 over the Easter period, in which nationalists rose up and tried to push hard against British rule, British occupation. There was a large number of troops serving in Ireland at that time, training in some cases to go to the Western Front, garrison there too. And when you read the accounts of men who were on the front line, initially you see quite a lot of shock amongst these men because they see themselves as the kind of pathfinders of Irish nationalism, that they're doing their bit on the front line so that Ireland can be something different when this war is over. And perhaps when you kind of read the accounts of some of these men, they see what happened in Dublin in that April of 1916 as a betrayal of that, maybe. But then you see the British reaction to that uprising and what the British do in Dublin and to the men that they arrest and try and in some cases execute. And I think you see a bit of a sea change in the viewpoints of these men serving in these units on the battlefield, perhaps polarising their ideas about how important it is for Ireland to be different when this war is over. And you had quite a few men who were nationalist MPs serving within units on the Western Front, the most famous of which was Willie Redmond, who was the MP for East Clare, a much older man who served with the Royal Irish Regiment, later to be killed in the Battle of Messines. You had J.L. Esmonds, who was the MP for North Tipperary. He served with the Dubs, the Royal Dublin Fusiliers, and was awarded the MC for gallantry. You had Stephen Gwynn, the MP for Galway City. He volunteered and served in the Connaught Rangers, was on the Western Front. And Tom Kettle is someone who I've followed around the Western Front a lot, because not only was he MP for East Tyrone and served with the Royal Dublin Fusiliers and killed in the Battle of the Somme in September of 1916, he was a poet who wrote some very powerful Great War poetry. And he was a man greatly conflicted about everything that was happening at that time, about serving in the British Army, being an officer in the British Army, standing for his nationalist ideals, having connections to some of those who were involved in the Easter Rising, but continuing to serve. And for men like Tom Kettle, as an officer commanding Irishmen at the front, at that time, while the Easter Rising was taking place, there was a massive gas attack on the Lewes sector near to the village of Hullock, and that's where the 16th Irish Division were holding the line. They'd come over in late 1915, gone into the trenches in that sector, acclimatised, if you like, to trench warfare. And although this wasn't an active front, the Battle of Lewes was over, there was a lot of tunnelling operations that were taking place, and quite a lot of the men from the Irish Division took part in some of those as well. They helped out with the tunnelling companies, were attached to some of the tunnelling companies, and then the Germans reacted to that static front in that Easter period of 1916 with this big gas attack that caused hundreds of casualties within the 16th Irish Division. And I don't know for sure, but I don't think it would be an impossibility for some families to have men being gassed at Hullock while simultaneously other members of that wider family are taking part in the Easter Rising in Dublin. It shows the complexity, I think, of Irish history during this period, and shows what a watershed it was for Irish history in the way that Ireland changed as a consequence of the First World War. And I think we've got to really admire the bravery of men who felt something about a country that they believed had done them wrong, but still stepped forward as volunteers, not conscripts, as volunteers to serve and give the most valuable thing that they had themselves, and take that to a battlefield for which that life that they held so precious and their family held so precious could be snatched at any time, as it was with those Irishmen at Hullock. And later, a few months after the Easter Rising, 16th Irish Division goes into the fight around Ginchy, Ginchy and Guillemont, where it loses large numbers of men, and that's where Tom Kettle is killed, buried on the battlefield, but his grave destroyed by shell fire, and he's named today on the Chapval Memorial to the missing. And I think it's important for us to understand these kind of wider aspects of the First World War, because nothing, as we often say, was happening in isolation. You can't just look at those Irish troops as soldiers on the front line. You've got to understand what's brought them to that front line, what their motivation is, what their beliefs are, and how that affects the wider history of Great Britain at that time. It's really important. And if you want to know more about this, then I'd recommend Terry Denman's book, Ireland's Unknown Soldiers. This is a book about the 16th Irish Division, and it examines some of these subjects within its pages. It came out in the 90s. It's long overdue for a reprint. I've seen original copies go for silly prices, considering it's a book that was published less than 3 decades ago. And Terry Denman, the author, was a mate of mine when I lived and worked in London. Great guy, hugely knowledgeable about the Irish regiments in the Great War, in particular 16th Irish Division. And that book is, to me, really one of the most important written about Ireland's experience in the Great War in many, many years. So that's worth exploring. So I hope, Owen, that's kind of helped with your question. It's a complex one. And like I said, I'm not an expert on Irish history, but this is based on what I've read from the accounts and following people like Tom Kettle around the battlefields. It's clearly a complex subject. And as I all too often say on the podcast, probably it could be a podcast in its own right. Perhaps it'd be good to get some Irish historians on to talk about these elements of the First World War. And if Terry Denman's out there, I'd love to hear from you, mate, and perhaps we'll get you on to talk about this based on the research that you did for your book. So thanks for that one, Owen, and do leave your own thoughts on the podcast website, oldfrontline.co.uk, where you can go on there and leave a little comment in the page for this episode. If you've got your own thoughts on this, then drop them in there. I'd love to hear what they are. So let's move on to question number 3. This one comes from Valerie Bayliss. Just wondering what your opinion would be about what the progress of the war would have been if the sluices hadn't been opened on the River Yser in 1914. Did it really make such a difference? Well, in October 1914, the Germans were carrying out what was later called the Race to the Sea, where their troops were pushing towards the Channel ports. And at the northern end, this was taking place in Flanders. That led to the First Battle of Ypres in October and November of 1914. But north of Ypres, where there were French and what was left of the Belgian army fighting around towns like Dixmude and Ramskapelle and Newport, that area was very close to the Channel coast itself and the sea. And what the Germans were trying to do there was wheel kind of right around those forces, get onto that coastal plain, and then push right down it to come round the back of those Allied forces, the British and the French and the Belgians, in that area of northern France and Flanders, get round the back of them and try and outflank them, basically, by pushing down that Channel coast. And if they'd have been able to do that, then the outcome of those battles at places like Arras, where the French were fighting hard against the Germans, like the ground around La Bassée in northern France, where British and now Indian troops were fighting hard too, and in the First Battle of Ypres up in the ground around Ypres itself, with British and French and some Belgian troops fighting there, the outcome of all that could have been very, very different indeed. So the decision by the King of the Belgians, King Albert, to open up the sluice gates where the Yser Canal met the town of Newport in this crisscross of canal points and locks, open up the sluices in that wider area and flood what was essentially a flat plain. And in flooding that plain, as it moved up towards the coast, it prevented a huge German army, a force, coming round in that flanking movement, because they just simply couldn't move through that water, which in many cases was well above waist height. And it turned that whole plain into a flooded plain where, although some troops could move within it, more importantly, their cavalry, their equipment, their ammunition, their food, the guns that supported them, none of that could move in those kind of landscapes which were flooded, where the only roads were roads that were elevated above the flood because they were on embankments, which restricted movement, made any troops that moved on those roads prime targets to enemy artillery. This really changed the whole course of that element of the First World War, because the Germans couldn't carry out the plan that they'd intended to do. That simple decision to flood an area of that northern Belgian landscape, that flat ground around the coastal plain, had used the geography and geology and the landscape itself to change the course of a battle, if not a conflict, really, at that time. And that flooding changed that landscape for the rest of the war, because when the Germans couldn't move through there, and the fighting to the south, around Ypres and in northern France and beyond, when that resulted in another stalemate with the Germans unable to get to the Channel ports, both sides dug in, trench warfare began, and in that flooded area from north of Ypres up to Dixmude, to Ramskapelle, to Newport, and to the very edge of the coastal plain itself, that became a static part of the front as well, where many of the positions were built up above the flooded area in breastworks. There's an area near to the village of Pavis, for example, where you can walk along the old railway line, which was on an embankment, and the positions were built into that embankment, and that became part of the Belgian front line in that sector. And you'll find bunkers there, the remains of machine gun positions, and all kinds of battlefield archaeology from that static period when they had to adapt to the conditions of the ground that the Belgians had created through this flooding. And the Germans, of course, on their side of the battlefield, doing the same. And the nature of that flooding meant that that front would remain pretty much static until the end of the war. You can't fight big battles across it. If you couldn't wheel troops around it in the early phase of the war, before what became the Western Front was even thought about, once that Western Front was created and both sides became deadlocked against it. On the rolling chalklands of the Somme, you can attack. In Flanders Fields, you can attack around the Menin Road or on the Menin Road Ridge, on the Messines Ridge or whatever it is. But in a flooded zone, a flooded battlefield, that would continue to make any operations like that pretty much impossible. So the Belgian army holds that front in the northern part of the Western Front, the Yser front, for most of the war, just holding the line. But both sides shelled each other, sent rifle grenades over, there were gas attacks eventually, and on both sides, thousands of men were killed holding that ground along that Yser front. So that decision in 1914 had saved that last tiny pocket of Belgium. There's no doubt about that in my mind. Stopped the Germans from coming down that coastal plain and getting around the back of the Allied forces, around the back of the French and the British and the Belgians. But it had created this unique part of the Western Front that was stuck in a flooded landscape where movement was difficult, and even the construction of positions to defend your ground was challenging in its own right. A fascinating part of the Western Front, and I'll say it again, somewhere that we will return to for a proper podcast looking at that upper end of the Western Front in due course, and I've got plans to make some videos there as well. So thanks for that, Valerie, and hope that's a bit of interest. Let's move on to our fourth and final question, which comes from Bob Weeks. Bob says, my question is, when soldiers launched an attack, jumping from a trench, was there any specific order in which they exited based on their job, or was it just a mass exodus? My grandfather was a signaller, and I wondered if he was front and centre, or perhaps jumped out a little later after the main attack. This is a great question, Bob, and because the kind of warfare that the First World War turned into was not what everyone had gone to war expecting to fight, both sides adapted to the experience of conflict because of this. And if you look at some of the early attacks, I was near Witcharter the other day when I was over at Ypres, and there was an early attack there in December 1914 where two British battalions basically just left their trenches in a big mob, ran up the slopes with the Germans at the top, entrenched with machine guns and rifle teams, almost no artillery, and you can pretty much guess the outcome, where they lost a lot of casualties for no gain. So that kind of assault was not really well organised, and even in 1914, when the army was not as complex as it was in terms of different roles, different attributes within platoons and companies, and different weaponry, dictated new types of warfare, specialist teams, and men with specialist duties. There would have been signallers in that earlier attack that would have gone forward with the men, but I don't think that they were placed in any specific position. They just moved forward in this big mob of troops. Now that changed as trench warfare developed. And increasingly, when you look at the attack plans for assaults, you see this becoming more and more complex as the methodology of warfare changes and the types of weaponry that is developed to make that warfare possible are brought in and then are utilised properly. So to give a brief response to your question, the answer is eventually, yes, people did go out in different ways, in different waves, and it wasn't just a mass exodus. But let's take a kind of example of this and let's relate it to signallers, as that's your particular interest through your grandfather. So I interviewed two veterans that were battalion signallers. There were some other men who were signallers as well, but these two help us kind of explain this part of Great War history. One of those was Reg Glenn. He was in the Sheffield City Battalion, the 12th Battalion, the York and Lancs. And another one was Albert Bamfield, Bert Bamfield. Herbert Bamfield was his real name. He was from Hove, and him and his brother Marcus joined the 13th Royal Sussex, 3rd South Downs in 1915 and served with them till 1918. Marcus was sadly killed in the German offensive in Flanders in April of 1918, and they both kept really detailed diaries that their father typed up after the war. But of course, I also interviewed Bert Bamfield as part of my period of interviewing veterans in the 80s and 90s, and he was one that I got to know particularly well and went to see on numerous occasions. So through Reg Glenn and Bert Bamfield, I can give you a bit of an insight into how things unfolded for them. And we're talking about 2 consecutive days here, because the Bamfields went over the top with the South Downers at Richbourg on the 30th of June 1916, and Reg Glen went over the top with the Sheffield City Battalion at Serres on the 1st of July 1916, the first day of the Battle of the Somme. Now, in both that attacks, this is by mid-1916, as offences have got bigger and bigger, rather than just send men over in one big mass, you're starting to see companies within an infantry battalion, there's 4 companies, being used in a wave effect. So there'd be a first wave of men going over from one company, a second wave from men from another company, and then keep one or more companies in addition to them as a battle reserve, and perhaps send a third company forward as initial support and keep one back in the trenches. So not everybody went at once. There were within the battalion specialists, so there would have been by that stage men in the machine gun section that would have Lewis machine guns, and they would go over in support of the different companies with machine gun fire and suppressive fire to enable those infantry to move forward. If they encountered the enemy, the Lewis machine guns could be used to lay down automatic fire to hopefully suppress a German machine gun or a team of riflemen in a trench. You also had men that were equipped with rifle grenades, and they could use those in the same kind of way to fire them like mini mortars, basically fire a grenade up over the battlefield at short distance, drop it into a trench, drop it into a machine gun team, drop it into a bunker. You also had snipers that would go forward with the battalion to protect it, often on its flanks. You had stretcher bearers that would be behind some of the waves, so they would be attached to each wave, and they would be there to pick up the casualties and bring them back to the regimental aid post. And then you had the signallers. The signallers were the ones whose job it was to keep the headquarters of the battalion, so the lieutenant colonel commanding the battalion, up to date and linked to the men on the battlefield. They would go forward with the main assault and get into the objective they were about to capture, set up a signalling post there to relay information back from that captured ground back to a relay post behind, perhaps back in the British front line, and that would then be relayed onwards to battalion headquarters. And although some units went over the top with the commanding officer, the lieutenant colonel commanding that battalion, actually leading the men into battle, and often becoming a casualty themselves, there would be a headquarters element, no matter what, back in that British front line, perhaps back in a support or reserve trench or in a position behind it, where they would be there waiting to receive information from the signallers going forward. So when we look at the experience of Reg Glen and the Bamfields, they were signallers attached to the companies that were about to make the attack. And in the case of Bert Bamfield and Marcus, they were split up in their signal section. Bert stayed in the area close to the British front line. Marcus went over the bags, over the top, with some of the advanced companies that made the attack on the Boar's Head position at Richbourg on the 30th of June. And his job was to go forward with flags and with a Lucas lamp to use that to signal back to Bert and his comrades who were back in the British trench with information as to what was going on. Now, this is very dangerous work, and it's not surprising that Bert Bamfield nearly got wounded himself, and Marcus was actually wounded because he was right out on the battlefield and at one stage got into the German trenches, and in the battle there, the attack was thrown back, and he was one of the hundreds of casualties in those Sussex battalions on that day. Reg Glen, he was actually in the signallers that were sent to go forward, and at Serres on the 1st of July, he went with the infantry platoons and companies as they made their advance from the edge of the copses up that gentle slope with Serres in the distance, through the long grass in no man's land. It wasn't smashed to bits, it wasn't a crater zone, it wasn't Passchendaele, it was an overgrown field, and the grass was waist high. He remembered that very clearly. And as he was moving through that grass, he suddenly saw the men on his left and his right dropping into it, thinking that an officer had given an order to take cover, because in the distance he could see machine guns and rifles firing. It was quite a surprise to him because they'd been told it was going to be a walkover with almost no casualties, and he ducked at that point, and what he was actually seeing was the infantry soldiers around him being cut down by enemy fire, and he ducked at the right moment, and that decision saved his life. What should have happened is he should have gone forward with those men, established his signals post in the front line, and then relayed that back to near Touvon Farm and the copses where the rest of the battalion signallers were, and again created that kind of rear link where you're linking up the signallers in the forward zone of the battlefield with the men behind. So that's a more detailed kind of view of what the signallers were doing and how they would go over, but that applies to just about every aspect of an infantry unit going into an attack. Men were put where they were needed, and in some diaries you can see diagrams and sketches showing the layout of an assault with platoon there, platoon there, platoon there, rifle grenades and there, Lewis guns on the flanks, and then supporting troops, stretcher bearers, signallers in this position and that position. Now, not every war diary contains that kind of information. Sometimes it's laid out in typed operation orders, but if you kind of scratch the surface, you may well find that coming across in the online war diaries you can find on Ancestry and the National Archives and many other places besides. And you'll also see reference to this in battalion histories, in particular battalion histories, which kind of go into much more detail about this subject. So once again, it kind of reflects the changing nature of trench warfare and the whole development of the British Army and its Commonwealth forces on the Western Front, because Australians, Canadians, New Zealanders, South Africans were all doing exactly the same kind of thing as the war progressed. And it shows how the British Army went from a highly motivated, highly trained volunteer army in 1914 through to a conscript army led by veterans in 1918, but truly as well a modern army with modern approaches to warfare and fighting, and this was all part of it. So thanks for that, Bob, and I hope that's answered it to a lesser or greater degree. Thanks for all the questions this week. Keep them coming, and as usual, you can send them in via the two main methods, which is email or on the Discord server, and there's links to both of those in the show notes for this episode. Thanks for your questions. Look forward to answering some more when I see you again for another session of questions and answers on the Old Front Line. You've been listening to an episode of the Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcorps. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.